Welcome to what I hope will be a new format on the channel, and that is where we have these multiple conversations with people who are extraordinarily dynamic, influential, and compelling. The first one today, I think, are two of the most cerebral, but also the best communicators around the Ukraine issue. That is our favorite Anna from Ukraine and Jonathan MS Pearce. I'm going to get each of you to just quickly introduce each other rather than doing my long, monotonous monologue. So, Anna, first, let's have a few words for the audience. For those who are not familiar with you, I doubt whether there's anyone who doesn't know who you are, but just a couple of words, introduction.
Thank you so much. Happy to be among your beautiful community. My name is Anna and I'm from Ukraine. And I think with all this complex and multiple identities that we develop in our social life, still your own country, your background is very important. And I vlog daily about my beautiful country, Ukraine, that unfortunately became in the center of global attention because of really evil events. And I try to share this ordinary experience of a civilian because I believe to understand Ukrainian spirit and Ukrainian resilience, and also our dark past being occupied by the Soviet Union or various Soviet myths, you do have to share more stories from this ordinary daily life of Ukraine. And that's what I'm doing. And I'm always glad to tell and share more. And I'm very grateful to all those people who support Ukraine and who want to know more about us. Thank you.
And Jonathan, over to you.
Well, I started off this, well, before the war started, in at least its 2022 iteration. I was a philosopher of religion, writing books on whether or not God exists and existing in a sort of kind of philosophical domain, whilst also writing for a media outlet called Only Sky. And I became obsessed with the war in Ukraine, primarily because it was so deeply unfair. So it really hit me on a moral level, that how could the second greatest army in the world and this superpower, although we can talk a bit about that later, how did it get to invade a sovereign independent country and seemingly get away with it? And so it really, I became super obsessed with it, and I haven't stopped being obsessed with it since I had a philosophical YouTube channel that then morphed into, well, it split into a Ukraine war news channel where I talk about the geopolitics concerning the war in Ukraine and actually how it is now affecting so much more of the world. I now believe in a thesis that we are indeed in World War III. It's just that most people don't know it. And I think it's not only incredibly morally significant what is taking place, and that's how it affects us on an individual level, but on a nationwide level, it is insanely important. And that's why I talk about it all day, every day.
And those are the reasons why I'm delighted to have both of you on the channel. And of course, I don't usually do, I usually ask the questions rather than just chatting away, but I have shared on a couple of videos, my motivations for doing this. There are probably more than I can explain here. But, one of the chief ones, of course, is having lived and studied in the other place and even worked in the other place, the place we shall not mention. It does provide an insight into the behaviors, the mindset, and what's going on. And I guess the first question is going to be, it still strikes me that a lot of decision making, a lot of policy making is based on a complete misunderstanding of not just the Russian mindset, but the mindset of Putin, his elites, and how that system functions. Anna, is that your impression too?
Oh, definitely. And another mistake inherited from this vision of Russia is equating Ukraine to Russia, same as a very big part of what is often called as Eastern Europe or even Central Europe. I think this was one of the greatest geopolitical and even simple human mistakes. But no one is to blame because the responsibility is, of course, on the authoritarian communist regime and also on our nations that when renewing its independence, and I want to stress renewing, gaining it once again, not for the first time, we did not speak loud about ourselves. We believed we still have time to develop, to change, and so on. That's why for many, Ukraine was the greatest geographical discovery of the 21st century. And, the more I look back into our history, analyzing some very tough moments, feeling the need to explain it to those who think this is a new war, this is a new conflict. No, this is not because of NATO biolaboratories or any alien interference. It's because, at least for the last 300 years, Russian Empire cannot imagine itself without the active, creative, dynamic, and very European country at its border. And there are lots of examples how they wanted to destroy us. And honestly, once again, the more I analyze our history, the more I'm surprised at how resilient and strong actually we are. I believe many beautiful nations that existed in the 17th or 18th century disappeared under similar pressure, and we did not, with lots of these bans on cultural activities, language, and so on. But at the same time, this is a huge civilizational gap between Russia and Ukraine and Poland and Germany and so on. And the problem is that many democratic countries still want to analyze Russia using these instruments and tools measured for more or less democratic countries, when we actually have a totally criminal gang that is full of criminals, gangsters. They actually pass power to each other, and you discuss it on your channel too, how more and more of Putin's and his friends, relatives become parts of the new Kremlin power. Now there is a documentary about Kadyrov and his reign and many other things happening. And I think I have this feeling that more and more countries are close to understanding this finally. After 2.5 years of war, it seems to me that in the speeches of some European decision makers, we can recognize some things when they've actually cannot unsee what they see. And for me, Russia is an horde, not even an empire. It lives by looting, by stealing. War is necessary for Russia's survival. It's fighting not for the territories. It needs it to continue boiling, rotting, or whatever they do on this swampy territories. So that's why, just as we cannot judge North Korea, new Russian friend, using standards of an average EU country, for example, the same goes about Russia.
And Jonathan, I mean, you and I are not at the pointy end, as it were. We're far away from, I wouldn't say Russia's influence, but we're far away from, the front line and from Russia geographically. You've been on a journey, however, of discovery, peeling away the layers of the onion, as it were, to try and get to the heart of what makes Russia tick. I suspect that's something, we haven't got to the center. We're still going to keep peeling and peeling through the tiers. That's how I think of any research around Russia. It's a very sort of sour, very stingy onion. What's been the biggest discoveries for you on this sort of journey of trying to understand what's going on and what makes Russia tick and makes it behave in the way it does?
Oh, I don't know. I've got the time to answer that. Goodness me. One massive worry for me is a realization that we are fighting this war on our own front lines. So it is the case that conventional warfare is taking place on the front lines in Ukraine, obviously. But as I said earlier, I think we're in World War III and we are fighting on the information spaces. All three of us here. We literally, like the way I see it, well, not literally, kind of metaphorically, the way I see it is the information spaces are, I talk about maps on my channel. I'll say, right, the Ukrainians have moved here, the Russians have moved there, and I move lines on a map. But for each individual in the world who has an opinion about Ukraine, about Russia, and about politics and how things should be, there's like a map in their brain, and there are movements either way as you're put under pressure by the invasion into your head of disinformation. And so the Russians are invading our heads, and we need to fight back, and we need to present our own positive narrative of what the world should look like. We should present a positive narrative of factual understanding of what Russia is to the Russians. We need to be fighting in the information spaces, just as we are also fighting in the cyber spaces, in cyber warfare, and we are fighting in the economic spaces with sanctions and the political spaces. All of these are different domains of the same war. Russia is undermining the political movements around Europe and America with disinformation to try and get countries to vote in parties and politicians who better support the Russian objectives, and that is their way of winning the war. I think they can. I think they realize now they're not going to win a war on the front lines militarily, but they can win by undermining military support from other nations by disinforming the electorate and meddling in political machinations. So I'm super worried, and disinformation is right at the top of my list of concerns.
Well, that's going to be a great one to sort of fire back at Anna, because propaganda doesn't just create problems, it tends to try and leverage problems that already exist, whether it's divisions in society, classes, politics, the sort of left-right dichotomy, wokeism, cultural wars. It just tries to find stuff that's there and prise open those divisions and cracks. And unfortunately, it seems to be actually remarkably effective at doing that, despite it appearing crude and so on. Is it true to say that Ukrainians have developed a certain level of resistance to this? Or is it something that still needs to be worked on continuously? And the kind of propaganda that's directed at Ukraine, which may be slightly different from, say, the propaganda directed at the UK, Europe, Global South, India, wherever it sort of morphs and changes depending on the audience.
You're right. Well, first of all, of course, I'm sure no one believes now that Russia is the second strongest army in the world. But it can definitely be the first strongest army in the world when we talk about the informational warfare. What is also bad about Russian propaganda is the fact that they build it on centuries of Russian imperial propaganda, then Soviet Union. Of course, some messages changed and were substituted, but many of them remain, like three brotherly nations, with Russia being the elder one and deciding for everyone, and so on and so forth. And it's very difficult to counterfight them, because many of people who want to see Ukraine, who want to trust, to believe, to understand the true soul of my nation, they still under the effect of this messages of these narratives, and their parents were, and their great parents were, and that's the way they saw this part of the world. I always repeat one of the very first comments that I received on the channel when a good subscriber told me, please keep it simple, because for many of us, your country was just a problematic part of Russia. Unfortunately, this is the reality. What is also bad, Russia is very, very sensitive to what is happening in our countries. And it adjusts, tailors its propaganda messages to the peculiar problems of Britain, Ukraine, Moldova, Italy, and these will be very different messages. Of course, they have some absurd stuff like Simonyan and Solovyov shouting, but for intellectual, exquisite audience, they have their messages that may not even mention Ukraine or Russia. They will focus on various problems, falsely connect them to some government decisions, and then lead you to this doubt whether you should support Ukraine, or, I don't know, armament for Ukraine or something like that. What is also true, we have worked on the analysis of Russian propaganda for the documentary Great Russian Lies, and it seems like now they try to produce multiple truths. So they do not say that they are not lying or something, but they want to say, oh, there are different versions, and depending on what you choose, you may choose a different kind of truth. And by the way, when you have introduced Jonathan, I have remembered about the interview we had with Luke Harding, who is a the Guardian journalist who often visits Ukraine, wrote a number of books and a great
I read
support
his I read his book, actually, his last
yeah,
book is good.
and we have interviewed him for our documentary, and I remember one of his phrases, and I often repeat this because this is a kind of like a moment that was a revelation for me. And he said he was interviewing Simonian and other people like years before the invasion, but he said he's not religious. He did not believe in God, but talking to these people, he realized that this pure evil exists, pure darkness exists. And what frightened him, terrified him, is the fact that they know they are doing evil. It's not that they
Yes.
are deceived by their image of the world and they think they are doing it for the better, they are saving us or whatever, liberating, as they say. No, they clearly know they are murdering, they are looting, but they kind of accepted that and they started getting joy and energy out of that. And that's the moment.
I find that really interesting, because I often wonder with people who do that, who are spreading overt lies, whether they know they're spreading lies, whether that is indeed purposeful. And then therefore, if it is purposeful and they're using these nefarious ends to what they seem is a greater good, do they see that as a greater good, or are they just thinking about their own futures? Like, I have to say this because I need to look after myself. Like, if I don't say what the Kremlin wants, then I'm going to be for the chop. So, like, what are all the I have such great conversations in my head about the motivations of these propagandists and really what's going on with them.
Yeah, so his vision is that they've committed enough sins, they need money, they want this power, and they kind of like it how they can fool the world. And this is actually worse than you are bad, but you still think that you're doing something good. Maybe you're very wrong, but your motivation is more or less positive. And he says, no, there is nothing like that. What makes them more dangerous, what makes them more apt, is they know it.
Yeah.
And they kind of mock their own society, the world, and so on. And he said, this was the moment when I started doubting maybe God exists, because if such evil exists, there should be a similar size of good.
Don't get me started on these arguments, Anna.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but let's use it metaphorically, whatever you prefer. But I think this is another important moment we have to understand, because still, I see that people who support Ukraine, people who value democracy, they're different democracies to a different extent and so on, but still these are good people and they are trying to find good in others. And I still have lots of subscribers who believe Russians don't know something, or maybe Putin does not understand the essence. I know that at the very start, there were rumors that when Zelensky learned about the crimes in Bucha, he himself believed that Putin does not know the size of these crimes, that these are just like, we have to show him, no, they know it and they like it. And that's what we have to understand. And that's why more and more often I feel that the best solution is actually to block all Russian sources than to, I don't know, like debunk them. It's just like North Korea now, and uniting with it. For me, it's very symbolic. And I think we should start treating all these Russia just as we treat North Korea.
Yeah, I think absolutely.
Can I just react? There's so much I would like to react to there. I'm sorry, Jonathan. Jonathan, you asked about, are Ukrainians still susceptible to Russian disinformation? I think disinformation can happen on many different levels, and it will be far better placed to talk about this though. But the other day, one of my friends told me that there was this bit of disinformation floating around Ukrainian society, that now that the energy facilities and infrastructure have been so badly hit, there are a lot of generators that are on the streets, and there was this bit of disinformation going around that you had to turn your generators off because if they're too noisy, then they'll come and get turned off by the local council or whatever government. Anyway, this was going around, lots of people were panicking, and this was Russian disinformation floating around society. Now, this isn't your kind of big narrative disinformation about the ideas of geopolitics. This is a very kind of practical bit of misinformation or disinformation. And so that had apparently lots of purchase within Russia and within Ukraine. And Ukrainians are susceptible to Russian disinformation in Ukraine continually. It is a massive fight for them on a daily basis, as far as I understand it, but it cannot operate in these different levels, the practical kind of mess around with the way you are behaving on a daily basis, up to the kind of more geopolitical, political, moral, social.
I think that's a fascinating point because we tend to look at the big global narratives, the ones that get into, foreign policy and get absorbed into articles. That's the kind of stuff I think we
Yeah.
we tend to follow, the sort of big media narratives. But speaking to a documentary maker called Michael Anderson, who was on the channel a week or so ago. He's been around sort of Donbass. He's been in Ukraine a lot, for more than 10 years, traveling around, reporting, making documentaries. And he said a very interesting thing that is, if you look back at 2014 and the Russian infiltration of Donbass, and even before that, how it used informal power networks, mafia, local media, oligarchs, trade unions, also whatever networks it could weaponize, its propaganda operated at a very local level, playing off local grievance. And that went below the radar of the government in Kyiv. And to an extent, that's below our radar. And I think a lot of Russian
That's perfectly
propaganda,
apt. That's
yeah,
exactly what I was talking about. Yeah.
and it still operates sometimes, the Russian propaganda that we spot, we think, oh, we're smart because we've spotted it, we can see it, but actually exists at multiple levels if you zoom in, zoom out, and it's the narratives that you don't spot that I think are the most dangerous ones. But Anna, I mean, you're there on the ground. Is Russia still trying to influence things at a kind of micro or local level, especially in occupied territories?
Well, it goes without saying. And once again, as I've mentioned, they are very sensitive to local context. And be it in Britain or be it in Ukraine, we have to keep in mind that war is an extremely exhausting experience. And even if we look normal, then I sometimes analyze even my schedule, and I realize it's not normal. It's, when we set the time for our meeting, I have to keep in mind that we have electricity shortages, blackouts that will prevent me from working. And there are also air raid alerts that will not let me enter a bank or something. And there's so many things that I have to fit in the schedule that, of course, people are stressed, even if they look healthy and normal. Different processes are going on, like mobilization. It is never simple. Lots of fakes, lots of negatives about mobilization in Ukraine are brought by Russia. Inside Ukraine, trying to demonstrate, oh, your constitutional rights are violated or something, and outside Ukraine, because I have subscribers who say, how come you don't have millions of people who want to join army? Then we will not support you, and so on. For example, how these may work. Or during this recent Kharkiv offensive that turned into total failure for Russians, they were desperately trying to terrify people of Kharkiv, saying that it's a very common message, for example, on Telegram channels, Kharkiv Telegram channels that are not controlled, like, why do they have so many air defense in Kyiv and they don't have that many in Kharkiv? They don't care about you, Kharkiv. They care about Kyiv, they care about Lviv, but they don't care about you. Or messages telling that someone has, like Vovchansk, and then Kharkiv for sure is the next. When, for example, the country does the country, it's extremely important to keep people in those cities if they've made the choice. I know, it's understandable, many leave their homes, refugees are everywhere, but I am a great supporter of those who stay. I have never considered myself leaving the country, and I have great respect for those who remain, because working cafes, working supermarkets, schools, hospitals, this is what actually makes this country alive, and it's vital for the survival. And Russians are trying to influence so that more and more people leave, for example, Kharkiv, leave Dnipro, leave Sumy. When country does the country, for example, I have electricity outages in my semi-safe region, and I live more or less normal, life, with no explosions on a daily basis. And in Kharkiv, they rarely turn off electricity. Only when something crucial is destroyed. They try to provide people with electricity, with water, with internet. They have less shortages. Why? Because we don't want them to leave. We want them to stay. And I know that even my friends who live in Kharkiv, for example, they were susceptible to some extent by these messages that no, Kharkiv will fall, they will get it. And then articles appear in Western media. And Ukrainians will not consume information coming from Russia. But if it is a Washington Post opinion, it's really difficult to explain to ordinary users that it's an opinion. It's not like it's a special article where a person, but still, why this opinion appears on the pages, and so on and so forth. So
That's a really
Russia tries.
important point, because mainstream media can be just as victim to the Russian narratives that seep through, maybe really insidious and really kind of nuanced, but people pick up, and it comes through, and it's how this feedback loop works. So Russia export this disinformation, and then it gets re-imported in Western media back to Russia. So they say, look, this is happening, but actually they were the ones that sowed the seeds so that it comes back. And obviously that the same happens to Ukraine, where mainstream media can come feed that back into Ukraine, and then you think it's factual, Ukrainians think it's factual, and then it's that is adding to the problem.
Yes, it was just like inside Ukrainian society, for example, recently there was a huge reaction to the headlines after Putin's peace plan. Lots of respectable, normal newspapers came out with headlines that, like, Putin is ready to negotiate for peace if Zelensky orders to deoccupy the territory. So they were trying to make like Ukrainian troops are occupying these regions that Putin wants to get. But these are Ukrainian regions. You cannot say they are occupied by Ukraine. And this was all over internet. And I really think that they did not have a bad intention. They simply repeated Putin's peace plan, put it on headline, but it sounds like that. So Ukraine has the occupied regions and Putin will negotiate for peace. And if we're fighting for global south and so on, that's what they read. Like Ukraine occupied something, and if they deoccupy, they will be happy.
This is really important because, sorry, like exactly what you're saying, because I had a little segment on one of my videos where I put a Reuters reporting on that, which was a responsible headline, and it talked about basically Putin making an ultimatum for the Ukrainians, and it was kind of ridiculous and whatnot. And then you had the ITV, which is one of our main TV stations in the UK, doing exactly what you said. And I was saying, look, I don't think these authors are on purpose saying it in this way. They're just, people don't understand the strength of words, I think, especially when you're not involved in something like this. So when they put something like, for example, Putin asked for a ceasefire if Ukrainian troops withdraw, and it was something that it was like that, and that's a really important way of phrasing it. That if you don't know anything about the conflict, which the most UK viewers would have been something like this, they would have thought, oh, it's up to the Ukrainians to do this. Oh, the Ukrainians need to withdraw, and it puts the onus on them. And it's just, words are really important, and if you are writing headlines, you need to be responsible.
And that's
extremely. I remember.
where Anna and I connect. We connect on the power of words, don't we? I mean, a lot of our conversations really, in the end, come down to the power and the meaning of words, and taking them incredibly seriously. And that, ironically, is part of you know, the day job I do, is deconstructing the psychology of language and not assuming, well, I think the idea, there's a myth that exists in the media, there's a myth that exists in academia, there's a myth that exists actually in society as a whole, is that language can be neutral. I don't think it's possible for language to be neutral. It always conveys some kind of meaning, whether that is conscious or unconscious. It always conveys a point of view, an opinion, a bias. And I think that idea of the neutrality of language is extremely dangerous. And we kind of need to go beyond that to have a far more conscious effort to deconstruct, or even when we're writing, to, you know, question the implication of everything we're writing. So, sorry, I'll let you jump in there.
No, I think it was a perfect continuation of our thoughts. These are simply phrases that irritate, like happening in Ukraine. It's not happening in Ukraine, it's happening to Ukraine. But when you hear happening in Ukraine, you say, oh my God, when will these Ukrainians start doing something normal? Or after the peace summit, here in Ukraine, we were celebrating that so many countries show up, and we may say that literally all the European Union stand with us, all the North America. And then I open media and I read like, global powers do not support Ukraine. China did not come, Brazil did not sign. But that was known It's good that like our partners in EU are becoming more sober about this third world war happening, and Ukraine just providing a delay for everyone to prepare. And I agree with you about language. Just as some quality medical articles, do you remember information about COVID? At a set moment of time, these sources, they were made to check what they share, because human life relies on that. And I think something similar should happen with war information, because they do blur images of wounded soldiers, but they forget about the importance of not distorting the information. And that's why, once again, without evil purpose, and this happens in Ukraine too, and you know that like negative information is spread faster, plus click bites, they always work. And unfortunately, it's not good when we deal with war. And to sum it up, I agree with you that language cannot be neutral. And the more I observe, the more I learn. I think that everything, history, politics, is very personal. Is very personal. That's why lack of personalities leads to some undecisiveness, delays, and problems. Because if we look in various serious moments of history, we always see personalities that move this history, that take people out of darkness, and that's the time.
Can I take us back to just kind of mention of the peace summit, because I think the roll of the dice there for Putin with the offering of the ceasefire just before the peace summit was, yes, it was timed for that reason, but also because I think Putin is somewhat desperate. And I think there's this, possibly we're in a period of Putin matching reality with perception here. And it takes me back to the beginning of the war. And interesting when Anna said about whether Putin knew about the horrors in Bucha. I do wonder how much Putin really knows about what's going on the front line. And let's take it back a step further, because I wrote an article right at the beginning of the war that when someone somewhere along the lines of, and this was back in, I think, March 2022, that how do I have more intelligence about what's taking place in Ukraine than Putin? Right, Putin invaded, and he was expecting, and the soldiers were expecting to be welcomed with open arms and flowers. Right, that's literally what happened. And either the Russian armed forces or the military hierarchy were telling a lie to their soldiers, you're going to be welcomed, but actually knew they weren't going to be, which is kind of weird. I can't see any reason why that would be the case. Or the hierarchy thought that as well. So how could they get it so wrong? So I've been trying to work out, and I think Varanyo's got a lot to do with this. So Varanyo is, for the viewers who don't know, so say Anna's my commander. I'm in the army. She's giving me 100,000 rubles to spend on training. I go and spend that on myself, I'm selling off the fuel that I buy in, I'm so on and so forth. I then give a report back to Anna and say, here's my report. This is how I spent it, and this is how well the training's gone. Now I know this is BS. Anna knows that my report's BS. I know that Anna knows my report's BS. Anna knows that I know that she knows the report's BS. And this is Varanyo. So you just have this merry dance that you do around giving information across to, in this case, a senior. So then Anna takes my report with 5 other reports and gives it to her boss. And then that dance happens again. And this goes up and up the chain of command until at some point it switches where someone actually believes it. Right, and so at the top of the hierarchy, you have the real belief that you have the second greatest army in the world, and yet here we have the Su-57, the 5th generation fighter jet that's not really all that. You've got the T-14, supposed to be the best tank, which is not all that. You've got the Kinzhal missile, which is supposed to be the hypersonic amazing missile, which isn't all that. At every point of the second greatest army in the world, we have like this Potemkin village of an army. We have this perception of what the Russian army is and the reality of what it is. And I think that is now merging, and this is causing Russia to panic a little bit. But I think Putin must have had garbage in, garbage out. He made the worst decision ever to invade Ukraine, if you think where Russia is at now compared to where it was 10, 12 years ago, right? So he invaded, and genuinely thought it was going to be a 3-day military operation, special military operation, and it accidentally became a war. And so you have disinformation or misinformation inside the Russian hierarchy. And I think we're in this period now where there's maybe a bit of panic, where Putin realizes, as the country is falling apart economically and with social welfare, you've got Irkutsk announcing today that they're not going to repair their schools until 2025 because money is going to the war effort. You've got this where reality hits perception, and yeah, I'd just be interested to see what Anna thinks about, like, how much Putin really knows about what's going on the front line. You've got a purge of the military that's just happened, Shoigu being moved aside, Belousov coming in. I think that is your reality coming home to roost.
Well, I think that's an important point. That was one of the questions on the list as well, actually. But I think moving Shoigu aside, he notably has not been arrested or persecuted because Putin, for his inner circle, tends to, value loyalty. He's not going to be punished for all his mistakes. Competence isn't a factor here, but clearly, as you say, he's at the top of the pyramid of Vragnon and sort of, BS and these, this layer cake of Potemkin nonsense. Patrushev also potentially was a source of this alternative reality. He's also been shuffled to one side, and I think that's crucial. Belousov hasn't been put in there to clean up the whole system. I mean, no one internally believes that's even possible. I don't think that's even part of the game plan. It's just that if Belousov can scrape together more resources, can requisition resources from the civilian economy, and I think he's been put in there to give Putin a more, let's say, factual version of reality. I mean, it's still going to be full of BS. Of course it is. But I think he's been put in there to give a slightly more realistic report to Putin about what's going on and to give him an idea of where they can scrape resources together to stay in the fight. And that's my perception there. And I think that's kind of what you're hinting at. I know our, internal Russian politics is not necessarily what you want to be talking about, but I know you have also done videos on some of these big changes that are taking place.
From an ordinary Ukrainian perspective, I definitely share this approach about Russian lies, that they lie on a different level, and this is a part of the corrupt system, of the hierarchical system, that, like, I'm reporting false numbers to you, I'm reporting false numbers, and you report them further, and we get our medals for good work. But everybody in the system knows that they are lying. Because when you receive my papers, I'm a liar, but you kind of need it and you lie further. So it is a mistake to think that Putin did not know the real state. He was also lying his way up. But I think this greatest difference is that they think that all around them, not only in Russia, but in Ukraine, in the rotting West, are doing the same. And this is where it breaks. Because in a bad, bureaucratic European Union, where corruption, for example, is also present as everywhere in the world, it is more or less controlled. I mean, all the actions, all the numbers, nothing that fake can exist. But they believe everyone does as they do. So they were saying, we are lying about the number of our bombers, and they are lying about the number of their bombers. Another thing is this great civilizational gap between our culture and Russian culture. It was actually interesting. I'm working on a book and I'm looking through the history that, for example, serfdom in Russia, and Russia introduced serfdom in Ukraine that did not have it. In the end of the 18th century, when the majority of Eastern and Central European countries abolished it, and in Western Europe, it stopped in the 15th century or something. And in Russia, they have always had this totally autocratic leaders, and even a second or third person to Tsar knew he could lose everything. A moment Tsar decides it. Nothing actually guarantees you anything. And that's why they do have a nation of people extremely obedient. People who see something and they follow what their boss tells them. In Ukraine, it's the country, like, and by the way, an interesting thing, that map of Magdeburg, right, cities, it also ends on the Russian border. And we have civil society, we have people reacting, protesting, and that's actually the people who did not meet Russian tanks with flowers. People were giving them seeds and asking to put in the pocket, so when they are dead in the soils of Ukraine, they can do something good. These were people. They were not advised by president or city council to say these things. This is the level of Ukrainian freedom, and it's important part of our identity. And Russians, they are different. They think it's important to obey. And if your boss tells you, if someone stronger tells you, you have to do it. And actually, I think if a bigger, stronger army would invade Moscow, it would not be a problem to reach it in 3 days.
Well, we see
Just as Prigozhin started.
we see Putin's body language when he meets Xi, and that's already happening to an extent. He doesn't sort of sit there and luxuriate with his legs apart, looking kind of in control. He's sitting forward in his chair with Xi, and Xi's got that kind of pose, like, I'm the boss here.
So it's worse than that. So a picture came out yesterday of Putin with Lukashenko, so the Belarusian dictator, and Lukashenko was leaning sideways, exactly like you said there, as in, I really need Putin's attention, and Putin was sat like almost like it's a Saturday night and he's got the popcorn ready, and he was like legs spread, arms spread, slumped backwards in like a big armchair. Like, I don't care about your opinion.
Slightly bored,
yeah,
whatever.
I run this show, like, whatever, mate. So and then they had a picture of not Xi Jinping but Kim Jong-un, right? So Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea, where Putin, and this goes back to where I think things are desperate, realities, hitting perception, because Putin is going cap in hand to North Korea, to Pyongyang, to say, we're desperate for your military equipment. We are in a bit of trouble here. And you had Putin sitting on the side, looking towards Kim Jong-un, and Kim Jong-un sitting it was like, it was a mirror image of the Putin Lukashenko. And like, oh my God, the power dynamics that you can read from that body language were insanely obvious. And Putin was begging to Kim Jong-un. Fascinating.
It is fascinating, isn't it? And Putin's done this. Putin's done this to his own country, which is extraordinary. I mean,
sorry to interrupt, Jonathan. I just going on to kind of what Anna was saying earlier and talk about information, how much Putin knows. There is also this nugget that I always throw in, and I've said this to you before, Jonathan, so sorry to repeat myself for your viewers, but Putin is also really paranoid. He's just generally paranoid, but paranoid about the internet. So he thinks the internet is a CIA propaganda entity, and so he doesn't use the internet. He doesn't have a smartphone, and when he receives information, it gets put in colored manila folders and he gets given the paper reports. Right now, I know as soon as someone gives any information to me that I want to verify, the first thing I do, I'm on my smartphone and I'm checking the internet. Right, we all do that. We live in an internet world now where we can independently verify things. Even a president of a nation will get on the internet and check things out that he's been told. Right, Putin can't do that. So when someone delivers information to him that might be a result of loads of Ranyo, how does he verify whether that's true or not? Well, he can go back to the very people who's given him that information, or he can go to other people, but he's still dependent on people. He's still dependent on those around him. And if he exists as a kind of victim to that information space, then he has no way of extricating himself out of that information space to verify anything that's going on. And I just find that a really interesting dynamic.
But as Anna said, even if he's presented with supposedly factual information, he wouldn't necessarily take it at face value. He would see it as false information. He quite possibly looks at the information he's given and thinks, okay, there's going to be a lot of nonsense in here. But he doesn't know which bits are nonsense, as you say, because he can't check it. I think Anna's point as well, that when Ukraine fought back, he wasn't thinking, oh my goodness, Ukraine is a nation after all, and they've got an identity and they're strong and whatever. He was simply thinking, oh, our propaganda has failed. It seems that American propaganda was more powerful because it's convinced Ukrainians to fight us when really, who are they? They're nothing. So this kind of paranoid, deeply cynical, total lack of any moral framework. And we're back to God here, but I think the Orthodox religion doesn't require anybody to think in moral terms or have any moral framework. You've got the bells and the smells and the nice visuals, but there's no
It's still a
function there.
patriarchate. It's still this
Yeah.
Russia have never experienced democracy. They've never experienced power. Just like what Anna was saying, the kind of serfdom element is imbued throughout their political history for the last 100 years, where they've been existing in some kind of authoritarian regime. They messed around with democracy for a decade or so. It failed, and now they're going back to what they know, which is serfdom.
And no Reformation, no Renaissance, no Enlightenment, none of these processes, which Anna can tell us Ukraine did go through and was a part of these processes and did experience it. But Russia hasn't gone through any of these things. Go to Orthodox Church, they don't bother to put the sermon, they don't really go in for sermons, but they don't bother to put the language into the common language that people understand. It's still kept in a kind of church Slavonic, a superior language, because there's no requirement to think. There's no requirement to internalize any kind of morality or lessons. Am I being too harsh, Anna?
No, if we're talking about Moscow Orthodox Church, because Kyiv Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Church switched to Ukrainian language long ago, and actually it is extremely democratic. And in Moscow Orthodox Church, yeah, you cannot cross the entrance wearing pants because, like, you are a woman. But you are right, and I think reflecting on what Jonathan has previously said is that Putin does not like. This is a very healthy behavior. Whenever you get information, you double check it because you are a sane person. Be you a YouTuber, be you a president. That's natural for a healthy, normal human being. I mean, mentally. And in case with Putin, he does not want to know. Like, he believes he is the constructor of the reality, and what he thinks is real. If your newspapers are writing some BS because you don't know the depths of Russian soul and so on, it is not worth my attention. He knows better. That's the attitude. I know better. So whatever you tell me, like Ukrainians are fighting, then they were zombified by someone better, as you've mentioned, or they do not understand, or they were paid. For example, like Maidans, they always describe them as coups. I have experienced that twice in my life, and I guarantee you this is not a coup, definitely. These were millions of people, and those who were not standing on the street, they were staying, praying, thinking in their houses, and so on. Just like volunteering movement. We donate crazy sums of money, and even those who hate government, who don't like city council, and so on. These are civil movements characteristic for our nation that had a period of Cossack state that was super democratic and so on. We have this instinct. I don't know. It's not like, it may be not a very, like, I don't know, intellectual, advanced person, but it is a part of her or his lifestyle, this kind of freedom. Actually, what was the reaction, like the start, what is often out of the focus is that at the very beginning, that revolution of dignity was known as Euromaidan, when Yanukovych decided not to sign association with the EU, what people wanted. And there were protests on the streets of Kyiv, mainly by students who wanted visa-free regime, traveling, that's obvious. And it was normal meetings, not that big. But when on the 1st of December, Yanukovych ordered to beat the students with special forces, millions of people went out because they did not want to let their children, their youth, to be beaten by someone who is a servant of the society. And this is what actually led to this revolution of dignity. Why? I have interviewed people who lost their relatives as a heavenly hundred and so on. And they were explaining we could not accept this happening. And they were coming from different corners of Ukraine because they realized something very bad is happening in the heart of Ukraine. And this is what Russia cannot comprehend. Once again, as they imitate everything, as they obey everything, the stronger, who is the stronger, who is, so, I mean, by force, not by something. They cannot believe that this is natural, that this is a real desire for democracy, that we like making choices, that we mock our politicians, that we are always dissatisfied with our presidents and so on. They cannot accept it. They think it's something paid, it's something artificial. And this is actually what made them make this great mistake that I hope will bury Russia.
But this is like a sign of the Enlightenment period of progress, is the ability to criticize. You know, you can talk about it in terms of religious terms, if you like, the ability to blaspheme, if you like, where blaspheming is criticizing your dictator god like Putin. Like, Russia does not have the ability. Russians do not have the ability to criticize, and that's the end. That's the end of your freedom. You don't have democratic representation if you can't criticize. Where what Anna is saying is that the Ukrainians, that is part of their cultural characteristic, is that they love to, it's like the French, you're president of France now, well done, you've been voted in, now everyone hates you. It's a type thing. It's that's just how it goes. It's interesting, Anna said something which I thought was interesting, and I'm going to add to it. So what Putin thinks is reality, right? Whatever Putin thinks is real, and I would take that one step further. Whatever he thinks is real, but if it ends up not being real, then he makes it real. In other words, Russian reality is his reality. What is just, he's obviously a dictator, but it's like, oh, I've just come to the realization that Ukraine has lost that, or we've lost that PR war or disinformation war to the US, is what you were saying, Jonathan. It's like, right, then we need to put that straight, which is we need to win that information war, and then we need to make the reality of Ukraine coming around to our way. And of course, there's no better way to convince people to come around to your way of thinking than invading them and killing them.
Yeah, and there's a classic book by David Satter, who is one of the first Western journalists to be expelled from Russia since the Cold War. Luke Harding, who you've mentioned, is another. And the title of his book is "It Was a Long Time Ago and Never Happened Anyway," which is a kind of classic. And I think this really talks about what power and what Russia is. The Kremlin is, I think of it almost like a black hole, a singularity. And beyond the event horizon, it believes it can distort reality. Now, they're trying to distort our reality through propaganda, but in Russia, they succeed. They succeed because there's no such thing as reality. Reality is what power dictates. And words themselves are entirely malleable. They have no connection to reality. So I think when people repeat Russian propaganda internally, it's not that they believe it. It's not necessarily that it reflects reality. And in fact, they may hold mutually contradictory ideas and believe each of them fervently, even though they absolutely contradict each other. And some won't really believe anything, but you're repeating the noises and the sounds and the words that power wants you to repeat. Now, there's someone who I'm communicating with who has been going into Russian chat forums and pretending to be an extreme Z patriot to see if he can change people's minds. And he's got this interesting theory about Russian internal propaganda. We look at it as we look at our own understanding of words, that they should reflect some kind of reality. Whereas I think he was suggesting through his experience that actually you don't have to believe the words, but you do have to repeat them, and you have to make the right noises, because that shows you're loyal to power. And it all comes back to power and
100%.
loyalty and this sort of singularity which the Kremlin represents. Because Putin didn't invent any of this stuff. He's not a very creative person.
Well,
I think he inherited a lot of it.
This is very Orwellian, right? So he who controls the future, no, he who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. And that bears a bit of unpicking, because you were talking about history, and I think you were almost tipping your hat to revisionist history. So the idea that Russia can revise its own history, people don't have an accurate understanding of who they are, what their country is, that's in contact with reality. So they if you control the present, you get to control the past. So you rewrite your own history, and then that gives you a sense of who you are and where you're going, which is completely false, but it's in line totally with what your intentions are for your country and your idea of what Russia is. So my idea of what Russia is the essence of Russia includes Ukraine, and I'm going to go to the past to do that. And if the past doesn't tell me that, then I'm going to rewrite the past so that it tells me that, and then I can create the future for me and for my country. And it's all of that kind of carry on.
I don't know if you think that's a useful idea there, Anna, and it's in stark contrast to those, and we started the conversation by saying that people, if they fall into the Russian sort of propaganda trap, will equate Russia and Ukraine as the same thing. But I think this attitude to history, and indeed to how culture is disseminated or imposed or created, is so radically different. In Ukraine, it's an organic process. It's an emergent process rather than imposed top down. Because Anna said, Ukrainians being so stubborn, they won't accept this kind of story flunked on them from above. But all of Russian history, mythology, all of this identity you've talked about, is not something that people are allowed to develop organically. And in fact, in various points of Russian history, where it has started to move towards the organic creation of identities, they've been stamped out, forcefully stamped out by regimes. And we think of the Bolshevik Revolution, and we think of multiple periods in history where some emergent identity was nipped in the bud because it's deeply threatening to power and that sort of vertical structure. I've probably talked enough, Anna. I don't know if there's if you want to pick through the bones of those ideas.
I have a question, I like it when our conversation provokes a question. You're right. Russia is famous for rewriting history books. I have a quote that I like when I say that by stealing history, you cannot steal the qualities needed for the construction of this history. But what is wrong with this nation that at a certain period of its development, it wants to steal the history, not just an episode, not the personality, a famous poet or someone who discovered radio, but they kind of choose it as their way to manifest themselves. Whenever you lie something about yourself, your accomplishments, and so on, you always feel bad. A normal person, like you don't want it. You want them to debunk it, and so on. It's not healthy. In every society, lying about your achievements or something is wrong. And this has to be something that big because they continue doing it for centuries. It's not an episode, it's a strategy. And once again, your nation, my nation, Moldovans, I don't know, Belarus, no, let's avoid Belarus, but I mean, anybody, any nation could start doing it, but very few choose this kind of rewriting and sealing. The majority keep to their own history, decorating it a little bit, maybe hiding some harsh moments, but the backbone is native. What is so wrong with them that they kind of don't want to know their real history, but they want to steal others?
The answer has to be in the question, and that is Russia is not a nation. It never has been a nation. It never developed nationhood. Rather, this entity, Muscovy, swallowed up and essentially genocided or stopped from developing other identities, other nationalities. Now, we talk a lot about, Yakutia and other places, which again were not nations when they were swallowed up. They were sort of native territories, but they hadn't gone through that nation building part of history. But there are places in central Russia which could have developed into nations. And if we look at the patchwork of countries on the African continent, it becomes easy to think that if this entity Moscow had not been triumphant and developed the mechanics and the political technology to turn it into a single land, then you might have had the nation of Novgorod, the nation of Uglich, the nation of Pskov, Yaroslavl, Suzdal, Vladimir. These could have all been nations and identities and developed in some way, but they were all stillborn.
I think another issue is that Russia or the USSR never went through the process that the Germans went through. And Germans have a word for this. It's Vergangenheitsbewältigung, and that literally means the struggle of overcoming the past. And what the way I understand this is that, and it's a process that's still ongoing, which is understanding the Nazi phenomenon from 1939 to 1940, or before that, understanding the past, understanding what happened with the horrors of the Second World War, with the Holocaust. You're coming to terms with that, recognizing that there's some guilt associated with that, and the whole kind of psychological process of going through almost like a national therapy session to get to where they are now. And that's not to say, you know, everything's all fine and dandy or whatever, but there's a recognition there of their own history that I don't think the Russians have ever gone through. So they've never kind of accepted the Holodomor. They've never accepted the, you know, the terrors that Stalin incurred upon his own population. And so since they've never come to terms with their own past, they don't have an accurate understanding of who they are in the present. And so they are continually manipulating the past so that they can manipulate the present and the future, and we get back to that. But I really feel strongly that they need to go through some big psychological process as a nation that they just haven't done.
And they need to de-imperialize. I mean, this is one for Anna here. It's not just that they haven't examined the past. I think many Russians have a mythologized version of the past, but revel in the process of imperialism, revel in the control of other territories and domination of them. Now, this isn't uniquely Russian. You know, we go back in history to, you know, whatever Bronze Age civilizations, medieval, pre-medieval. It's not uncommon in history for imperial entities to revel in the conquest and the eradication of other identities. What's unusual here is this has survived into the 21st century. It's an absolute, you know, it's like discovering the coelacanth. It's an extinct political system which somehow has lived on and not been extinguished. It's rotten. As Anna said in the start of this, you know, it goes rotten in the Russian soil, as many ideas through history have been planted there as seeds and, you know, have not come fully to bloom. They've sort of rotted in the sort of damp soil of Russia. This imperial idea has done the same, and unfortunately not evolved away from it.
Yeah, I fully agree that yeah, they are a modern imperialistic nation, and this kind of expansionism that Putin is going through at the moment, or trying to bring about in Ukraine he is trying to be the modern manifestation of Peter the Great, right? And the expansionism of as he sees this great, he doesn't want the USSR back. He wants the Peter the Great expansionist history back. That's what he wants, and he wants to be that great leader. He also is thinking about his own legacy. There might be ideas of him being ill, not very well, and ideas of mortality playing on his decision making. He might be on steroids, which is making him take bigger risks. But I think you put all these things together where he wants to be the new Peter the Great, and etc., all of that, and you end up with an invasion of Ukraine.
What's the solution, Anna? You know, how do we? It would seem from the German example that de-imperialization is the only solution to this.
Sure. And unfortunately, with Russia, this is happening like 100 years later than it happened even to softer and milder empires, because Russia was the worst one. And if you compare the serfdom, I don't know, in Poland lands and in Russian lands, these were two very different serfdoms. But first of all, I agree, and I think we've discussed that in one of our conversation videos, that you cannot control such vast territories democratically. Russia is too big to be democratic and too different. Plus, it is extremely centralized. It's not a federation as it claims. It is extremely centralized, contrary to some other big countries. This dissolution of Russia, not to frighten people with the collapse, would be a very logical and normal step. And then I feel that this is a trap of our democracies. And whenever I ask people who are responsible for strategic communications in the European Union and so on, and I ask them, is there a plan how we start de-zombifying Russians, how we start introducing them to democracy? Because they've never experienced that. And come on, period with Yeltsin was not that democratic. He brought Putin, and he started war in Chechnya. So we may say Russia has never experienced democracy. So, and the answer is we cannot interfere. This is their internal affairs. We have to let Russian society grow and so on. They cannot. They cannot. They simply will not do it. They don't know how. It's just like leaving your child in the jungles and waiting for him to start speaking English when there are no English speakers around, only elephants. And this is something what makes this process more complicated than it was in the beginning or middle of the 20th century. At that time, democratic nations were not that tolerant, and sometimes they interfered, and the process of Germany's denazification was very active, and it was not coming, like Germans were not the leaders of their denazifications. They were participants, active participants. They were made too, but this was not. And it's so silly that very many decision makers wait that, for example, Putin's regime collapses, but once again, Putin is the product of his population. He is not alien. He is their president. Like Churchill said, if the country is run by a dictator, it is not only a dictator to blame. And after we remove Putin and this criminal gang, this does not mean that democracy will boom in Russia. They don't know what it is. They disrespect it. They treat tolerance, diversity, freedom of choice as weakness. They hate it, and we have to teach them to like it. We have to introduce it, and we have to be persistent and strict in that. But there is no such plan, unfortunately, because this is treated as intervention, and we don't do that. It's bad.
That's a really interesting point because, yeah, they've been disenfranchised. Like I was saying, they've not that small decade of dabbling with democracy in the 1990s. They've essentially, and which they failed at. So they have had generation after generation for hundreds of years of complete disenfranchisement of their population. They have never experienced democratic power at all. So they don't know how to do it. And I don't want to be all like patronizing here, but I think that's the point you're making, Anna, is that they just don't have the tools. They don't have culturally the tools to be able to do that. And the problem is you'll have many people saying, well, we can't get involved because it'll look like Western imperialism. And that's a real challenge, because we kind of, it's not so much that we are trying to control you and make you something. Well, I suppose in a sense we are, but we're trying to help you. We're trying to facilitate you. We're trying to get you through this political therapy session so that you come out the other end a much better and stronger entity.
I think it's far worse even, and I don't want to be a complete sort of Cassandra on this, but if you look at the early 20th century, there's some awful, really appalling things in Russian history, and of course there's a lot of wars as well, and we see the patterns of aggression that we've seen. But there's also some interesting stuff going on in the sort of late 19th, early 20th century. You have the development of a huge industrialized population. You have increasing political agitation. You have the aristocracy getting involved in a lot more charitable work, zemstva, which are sort of local councils. You have the emergence of the Duma after the 1905 revolution. So there are little nascent signs, little tiny sort of spring shoots that could perhaps have developed into something a lot more. Of course, we know the Bolshevik Revolution not only forced most of the people out of the country, it also executed most of the people who were involved in any kind of emergence of any sort of civic society or any involvement in altruistic or political activity. Killed all of that stone dead. So I think the problem is far greater in that it's not just they don't know democracy, it's that all attempts at creating the nursery slope foundation are executed and brutally executed. And what has taken root in the Russian soil is a kind of FSB, KGB, ultra parasitic, ultra paranoid, psychopathic elite. So it's not just like we've got to introduce democracy. I think there are very few, even amongst Russian so-called opposition, who really understand the sort of state of abject, amoral, parasite class that has got its claws in society. You can't get democracy just by breaking it up and deferring power down. You got to go in and you've got to rip out the Japanese knotweed that has taken root at every level.
I love this metaphor, the soil. So essentially, you want to replace the soil. You can't replace the soil because that's the people. That's the what you would hope would be fertile ground from which democracy can grow. So we need to, okay, the soil is a little bit rotten at the moment. We need to fertilize it. We need to fertilize it with the ideas and the example of decent democratic values. Anyway, sorry, I just like a bit of metaphor.
No, I felt like a dark humor seizure, like that. Now we are fertilizing the soil, with Russian invaders.
Oh, very good. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's a dark humor, but there is such a thing that like people say, yeah.
And then the sunflowers grow.
Yeah, that's like Ukraine soils have always been fertile, but now they will be. I don't want this kind of vegetables. Anyway, yeah, you're very right. And of course, it's not a simple. I'm not saying that like dissolution and some grand programs for democracy building will help, but we should start with something. And even this promising Russian oppositioners and people that we have to support and rely on, they are also very often intoxicated by some of Russian narratives. For example, they do not want to invade Ukraine or invade Georgia, but still there are lots of things that they follow. I listen to some of those whom Jonathan, for example, invites on the channel, and they keep saying like Ukrainian nation is being born now. 90% of Ukrainians did not know Ukrainian before the collapse of no.
Not true.
No,
not true.
And they are not asking us. What is worse, they are not asking us. They will tell me that's because you were born in Volyn, maybe, and it was Poland, and that's why you think so. No, I can give you proof, but they won't listen to it because as big brother, and here we come to this toxic understanding that like I will never tell you something about your, I don't know, culture or nation. You know it better, and I want to learn from you. And they stopped. They like once again we return back to these lies, and they think you are showing off. You are trying to persuade that you have long history when you don't. I do.
but this reminds me of the idea. I got into all these arguments at the beginning of the war that, oh, this is NATO encroachment, or this is Russia doing this, or this is the West doing that. And people fail to see Ukraine as an end in itself. They see it as a means to an end. They see it as a political football. So Ukraine is just this pawn being used by the West, or this pawn being used by Russia. How about we ask what Ukraine wants out of this? How about we ask them what they see as their identity and their place in the world? And we just don't do that enough, or at least, people. Why have these arguments with Western people, fellow Brits and Americans, who take that anti-imperialism? They'd normally be critical of, say, US imperialism, and then see as the US being involved in Euromaidan and McCain and Nuland and all this and NATO, and you're like, yeah, it's just that, but it's ignoring what Russia were doing all the time before that in terms of little green men eventually, but even the infiltration into Ukrainian politics. But hang on, let's just remember to ask Ukraine what they want of their own future, and let's stop seeing it.
You're right, and some, especially those who know the answer, are afraid of asking it because this will put more obligations on them. Because Ukrainian people, they definitely have made their choice like 300 years ago, and one of the greatest enemies and symbols for Ukrainian independence is Hetman Mazepa, who chose to support Charles 12 or 13, I may mistake, in the Northern War, and wanted to develop an alliance with him, and it was described as the greatest betrayal, anathema in Moscow church, and so on, because Ukraine was once again choosing European direction, because like back in Kiev, Rus times and so on, it was our choice, and there were no NATO at that moment, and Russia committed a huge massacre in Baturin, which was Hetman's capital in Chernihiv region, a beautiful city, and like thousands of women and children were killed, and there are excavations on that place, and it can be equated to Mariupol, to Bucha, but it happened in 1708. And there were many other examples, and actually we were quite often betrayed. And I do agree that at the end of the Second World War, many beautiful nations were actually sacrificed when this Iron Curtain closed, and people did not want to check what's happening, because this could lead to more victims. People were tired after the Second World War, but to some extent, one authoritarian regime, another authoritarian regime, and millions died. It's just that you did not read about that in newspapers, but they did die.
Yeah.
And not only Ukrainians, these were also Russians. These were Poles, not being part of the US, but being on the communist. These
Lithuanians, you've got, people
the Baltics, in Czechia, and even in Hungary. I'm surprised that now they are in support of Russia. But there are lots of examples, and there are millions of people. For example, the last Ukrainian, and it seems like Stalin, but for example, one of the very famous Ukrainian poets of the 60s, Vasil Stus, he died in a Soviet prison because of his literature, because of his pro-Ukrainian poems in 1986. I was already born at that time. So this is not that, like, it's not only Stalin. And that's kind of, I think we demonstrate whenever we have this possibility that we are a part of the democratic, if you want to call it West, but I don't know. And speaking and hating, I know I meet people who hate the United States, who hate imperialism, and they have this, they know something more, maybe because they live there, they've experienced something bad, but they did not live in the USSR, and I hate it when we even had a conversation with Jason Stanley, who is a specialist in
his book How Fascism Works is a really good book.
And he came to Ukraine, and he was lecturing in Kiev's School of Economics, and we interviewed him for the documentary advertising the Great Russian Lies. But he is, to some extent, he could not accept the fact that Ukrainians hate that Soviet Union experience. He would say, no, it was not that bad, this Russian Empire. You were also working on this project and so on. And literally every Ukrainian in the classroom was persuading him, no, we hate it, we were made, and so on. It's not our choice. It was by Holodomor and so on. And I know that recently he said that he has changed some of his opinions but he's kind of very anti-US imperialism, and he thinks that Soviet Union was a good thing. No, no, it was an awful thing, and I can provide lots of examples. And once again, I hate comparing evils, but if we have to compare evil, okay, Ukraine was separated between Polish Commonwealth, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Russian Empire. It was not that good under Polish rule, under Austro-Hungarian, but Ukrainians were not banned from speaking Ukrainian. They were having their parties. Some of them were elected to Austro-Hungarian parliaments and so on. They managed to survive as a nation. And in Russian Empire, they were forbidden to baptize children with Ukrainian names. This is a totally different level of suppression and so on. And another thing I was thinking about today, that imagine, I never wish this to happen, it's somewhere in the parallel reality, North Korea attacks on France. Will someone doubt that North Korea is crazy and we have to end it in like a day or something because it has violates everything, it's totally crazy, and so on? No one, everyone would say. So it is just the same when Russia invades Ukraine, because Russia is just like North Korea, and we see it right now, and Ukraine is not that different from France in its choices, in its civilizational visions. It's just the same. But for many people, it would be very obvious with North Korea invading France, and with Ukraine and Russia, they have doubts.
So Russia going to North Korea cap in hand, Putin going to Pyongyang is a really good thing for the West. I mean, it's worrying, it's deeply worrying. But actually, if you're looking at the people that say in the US who are the MAGA Trumpians who are in support or not in support of Ukraine, and therefore de facto in support of Putin, actually you can't get a more obvious indication of who the bad guy is in this whole thing than Putin going to North Korea and shaking hands and sitting down with Kim Jong-un, because you have certain, I know it's a fringe, but it's a growing fringe. You have certain people in the electorate saying, I would rather Putin than Biden. I would, I support, I think Russia's not that bad. Hang on, in that case, then you are by extension supporting North Korea. And North Korea is basically your archetypal dictatorship. Is that really what you want? So actually, I think this is poisoning Putin by seeing him go to Pyongyang.
We should hope so. We definitely should hope that. And I think this you've hit upon all the questions I had without me actually having to prompt them. And this blanket of amnesia that was placed over Eastern Europe was going to be one of the questions that I wanted to end on as well, because we talked about the Russian power vertical, we talked about its ability to distort reality, and it's that distortion of reality it's trying to project into our societies. And we don't have to look far in history, because it was able to throw a blanket over half of Europe. It's as if it didn't exist, as if it didn't have agency or its own sort of history. All that just was muffled and disappeared. And anyone who's been to the capitals of Hungary, Czechia, etc., it's an extraordinary thought that to a large extent that world was closed off to Western Europe, and then we carried on living in our nice sort of privileged lives. It's as if we acquiesced into that oblivion which it was placed into. And I think the concluding word, we can't let that happen again. Now we're running out of time, so I don't know if each of you want to sort of have a quick word to sort of summarize up and maybe set the scene for a future conversation.
Well, it's always a pleasure, because you ask questions that provoke lots of thoughts and videos and conversations and ideas and potentially solutions to many of the situations we are in. One of the most important messages that I want to repeat, when so many countries want to avoid the Third World War, Putin, Kim Jong-un, and even Xi, they have already started it, and they are actually fighting it. And do not hide from this fact, but better prepare, and let's finish it faster and on our conditions. And continuing your beautiful description of the Southern Europe, Eastern Europe hidden behind the blanket. I would not say it's a blanket, it's more of something very evil and very painful, but let's think of all these opportunities that future victory can give us, when we will become stronger, when there will be new places that you can see and discover that will give you a new wave of creativity, potential, and so on. So of course, we don't want to live in the world where North Korea and Russia are ruling, but we want to live in the world where you can travel and discover Ukraine.
Couldn't agree more. My thoughts are that I am worried about the world at the moment. I look at Europe, and I look at the US, and I look at other areas of the world and think we are democratically backsliding. Things are going in the wrong direction. We are seeing our democratic processes and institutions being eroded. We are seeing our media be manipulated. And that is a real democratic worry for me. And yet here we have Ukraine fighting for its very existence and showing us to be this shining light of an idea of what they want to be. We want to be part of the European Union. We want to move forward, and we have this vision of what the European Union is, and we have a vision of what we want to be, and we have a vision of freedom and democracy. It's a kind of almost youthful exuberance as this country is refinding itself. And here we are in our mature democracies that have had time to start to age and become feeble and weak. And there is a strength in what Ukraine is showing us, and we should be looking towards Ukraine to relearn what it means to be democratic. I think to relearn ourselves a sense of what we should be aiming for. I think we've forgotten to aim for ideals in our societies as we just plod along and allow these nefarious entities to erode all that is good and proper in our democratic institutions. And yeah, we need to learn from Ukraine.
It's a fantastic place to end. Jonathan and Anna, I'm hugely grateful to you for this lively and I hope deeply thought-provoking discussion. And hopefully we'll continue this dialogue in future. Thanks so much. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!